Hello, everyone, from wherever you're joining us. Just a couple of things here. We'd love it if you just keep your video, on mute when you're not speaking. Please put questions into the chat. There will be an opportunity towards the end for questions. Now, this is our first guest-edited webinar for the Elders Council. We're very excited about it. We're thrilled that Katherine Milligan, who has joined us to host us today, and with her amazing speakers. And of course, the title for this event is recognizing trauma in ourselves, which we know is very, very important to each and every one of us and to all of you. So I'm going to hand over now to Chris to introduce Katherine and the speakers, and don't forget to put questions in the chat, and also we'll put your hand up at some point towards the end if you're not getting your question answered. So over to you, Chris.
Cheers, thanks a lot. And let me add my welcome to yours for this particular session, which we've been looking forward to. It's my pleasure to do the introductions. What could be nicer? So first of all, introducing our guest editor, Katherine Milligan. Not everyone knows, but she was named one of the top 100 women in social entrepreneurship by the Euclid Network. And she's, of course, affiliated with many innovation and entrepreneurship networks, including the Geneva Innovation Movement and the Wellbeing Project. She teaches courses on social innovation, entrepreneurship at the Graduate Institute for International Development Studies, Fordham University, and has many, many publications to her name. She is, of course, the past executive director of Schwab, and she now is with, the Creative Change Lab. I knew I'd get that wrong. And so welcome, Katherine. It's lovely to have you with us, and thank you for undertaking this particular session. Tracey, you're the founder and the chief executive of Taking Care of Business, which was formerly known as the Clothing Bank, and grow Educare centers. One of the things that I love most about you, amongst many things, Tracey, is the fact that you were recently given the Freedom of Cape Town, which is quite amazing. And that's just such a wonderful acknowledgement of your social entrepreneurial and community spirit, which was obviously recognized in that way. Our third speaker today is Vinya Ariyaratne, doctor. And you, sir, are the president of the Sarvodaya Shramadana Movement in Sri Lanka, which of course is the largest non-governmental grassroots development organization in Sri Lanka. An incredible achievement that goes back to your much honored father and whom we all respect a lot. You're a board certified specialist in community medicine, and you're currently the president of the Sri Lanka Medical Association. So that is our list of speakers today, ladies and gentlemen. And we are really, really pleased that you're going to be speaking to us as a panel. And I hand over to you, Katherine, as our guest editor. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And I didn't realize this is the first, so what an honor.
There you are.
I'm really pleased to have so many folks join us today. And our goal in the time that we have is just to bring a deeper awareness to the presence of trauma in ourselves, our staff, our communities, and our systems. And what does that mean? It sounds like a lot. It can sound overwhelming. And so we're just going to explore it and see where the conversation takes us. I want to say that this is a challenging topic. And one of the things we're trying to do is normalize discussions around trauma. And yet there is still so much stigma and taboo. People might become activated, withdrawn, shut down, sort of feel inadequate. I just want to name these things and say that they may show up, they may not, but if they do, we'll just notice them with compassion. And I'm going to start with just a few slides to sort of present the arc of research that we've been doing at the Collective Change Lab over the past year in collaboration with the Wellbeing Project that Chris referred to, and also Georgetown University. And then I'm going to stop and really, kind of showcase and bring into the conversation Vinya and Tracey and their practitioner insights and expertise. And I just need to have screen sharing rights, if that would be possible, but I'll go ahead and get us started.
Okay, that's great. Caitlin, are you able to give screen
sharing?
Yep,
perfect.
Thank you.
With a practitioner definition. Now, people in the medical establishment might, this is highly simplified, okay? But for our purposes today, this is what we're trying to convey and communicate, okay? The trauma is an active process caused by an overwhelming event, series of events, or enduring conditions. And it's not something that happened in the past, right? It remains active in our bodies and our psyches and our relational dynamics. So it really does impact our capacity to effectively engage with the present reality. And we think it's really important to start sort of here with the self, because we're all actors in the systems that we're trying to change, right? And we can't just intellectualize it and talk about trauma out there. We really also have to be willing to look in here. And I think many of you know that, the calling to social change work for many people, not everyone, there's a personal history there. There's a personal connection to the issue. So we have our own history, and to compound matters further, in those roles, oftentimes we are exposed to vicarious trauma, maybe even moral injury. So this notion of trauma impacting our capacity to clearly perceive and engage with the present reality, that's why we're talking about this in a systems change context, right? Sort of the past trauma, it doesn't stay in the past. It really does affect not just the present, but even the future course of our systems. This is a lot of text here, okay? So, bear with me. I'm not going to read through it. What I do want to convey is that while trauma is a very common experience, it might manifest in each of us differently. And for those who want the science, we're happy to share some links. We're not going to get into all the theory today. Probably we're familiar with the fight, flight, freeze responses. What's important to convey, what many of you probably know, but is there's an intelligence to these responses, right? The amygdala in the brain is wired to take over. It produces these responses. Those responses help us survive those life-altering, life-threatening circumstances. But if they remain unhealed and unprocessed, that amygdala can take over, can become activated again. And this might happen years later and tripwire us into fight, flight, or freeze again, even if the threat is of a very different nature, such as an emotionally charged meeting at work, or something that's highly contested in a professional realm. So the other important thing to note here is that oftentimes these responses are happening out of our conscious awareness. So I see myself in this table. I don't know if other people can readily identify and see themselves, their default trauma responses in this table, but it's an invitation to reflect on it. When you are in a heightened or activated state, when that you are experiencing stress, a sense of overwhelm, and the amygdala has taken over, what might some of the default responses that you experience look like. So the self is the foundation, right? That's why I wanted to, kind of cover that briefly, because we have to be able to do our own work and recognize these responses in ourselves before we can really recognize it out there. So really, this is a call for all of us to be doing our own trauma work, our own trauma healing. And that also really helps us discern ways of working that are likely to reduce, kind of re-traumatizing, re-triggering other actors in the system. So with that grounding, I'd love to widen the aperture very briefly. And just as we need to bring our own trauma responses into our conscious awareness, we also need to really think differently about trauma, right? Widen the aperture in how we view trauma. There's a prevailing individualistic narrative, right? Which reinforces an individualized medical model of intervention. And that's incomplete and even in many cases damaging, right? In that it can shift the responsibility for the harm and the burden of healing from that harm from the system to the individual. And that critique has been central in the groundbreaking work on structural racism in recent years. But if we really think about us taking a system lens, what it helps us see, and that's what we're moving into the conversation part, and I'm really keen to bring in Tracey and Vinya and benefit from all of their experience. One of the things that we've heard from the many practitioners that we've interviewed over the course of this research is that it helps us see that many individual expressions of trauma are at least partly collective in origin, right? So we all carry different, let's say, layers or pieces of trauma to varying degrees. And taking that system lens also helps us grapple with the complexity and resist the temptation to reduce or isolate, sort of what's happening in this person, either attribute it to their identity, right? We can separate the behavior from the identity, or reduce it to like a single event or cause. It's many things. It's all of the things, okay? And all at once. So I'm not going to read these definitions. You have them here. I do want to point to, again, beyond the individualized framework and the narrative around trauma, what we heard over and over again in our practitioner interviews is that there are intergenerational and collective dimensions of trauma that are almost always present, but never discussed. And so I'm going to open up our discussion now. Hopefully that was some good fodder and some good food for thought. There are a couple more slides. Maybe if we have time later, we'll get to them. But Tracey and Vinya, I just want to thank you both so much for being willing to share your reflections and your experiences with us as we unpack, what does this mean? Layers of individual, intergenerational, and collective trauma in our systems. And let's search for answers together. So I'd love, Vinya, maybe I'd love to start with you and then turn it to Tracey. And just the first question is really, you said yes to participating in this conversation. So why do you think it's important to explore the work of social change through the lens of trauma? And in your own work, what has that lens helped you see or do differently, even from a programmatic, kind of and strategic point of view?
Thank you, Katherine. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And it's a great pleasure and honor for me to join this conversation. And thank you for inviting me. So if I straight go into answering your question, Katherine. So my own training is in healing. I'm trained to be working as a doctor. So for the last 30 years, I have engaged in curing people who are affected by various forms of health issues. But particularly, Sri Lanka, the country that I come from, has been experiencing an violent internal conflict for more than 26 years, from early 1980s up until 2009. And when I started my own career as a doctor, the mainly I was working in an area where there was this conflict was really very violent, and the internal war was very much on. So from an early stage of my own career, I was exposed to trauma of others, and also I myself, after seeing the trauma of others, getting traumatized myself. So that was the man-made disaster or the armed conflict. Then we are a small country with 22 million people, multi-ethnic, multi-religious nation. And then this was an ethnic conflict where two communities were involved, but it was a separatist war. Then we also had the natural disasters like the tsunami. Large numbers were exposed to different forms of, trauma. And then we had, the other forms of trauma like biological disasters, very recently the COVID-19, and then the economic disaster that hit Sri Lanka, economic crisis, which also affected large numbers of people. So there is collective suffering. So as a person who is also involved in peace building work and working for an organization which is the largest grassroots development movement in the country, I was involved in finding ways of building resilience. And also, particularly in a situation where you have faced a war, there are unanswered questions. There are people who have lost their loved ones and no closure. They don't even know. There are large numbers who have disappeared. So the trauma exists in different forms. However, the healing process is also, you can have at a collective level where we bring communities together, silent meditation, collectively, group meditations, meditational walks. So it is about inner healing within individuals, but also collectively. And then you look at what are the different manifestations of trauma. Sometimes it goes unrecognized. So while working at a very individual and a collective or group level, we also look at what are the structural elements that further exacerbate or further worsens the trauma of communities. So there you have to work at policy level. What are the institutions that you really require to help in the healing process? So this is kind of the larger picture in which I work, and we are committed to also looking at what are the best ways of promoting this healing. It doesn't have to be, as you mentioned, a medicalized model of healing. No, there are cultural elements that you can use for healing. So we bring in that sociological dimension, the cultural dimension into healing. But there are certain things that you really need to use a scientific method of dealing, and there is a responsibility on the part of the government, the state. People need closure, you need justice, you can't separate. You can't just say forget the past. Time is a great healer. No, it doesn't happen that way. Some people really need closure in their minds to something that has happened. So we have to look at all dimensions. It has to be a multi-level and a multi-pronged approach towards healing.
Thank you so much. I think one of the webinar, in the description is, and what can we do about it? And so you're already pointing us in that direction, right? Of all different kinds of healing modalities and approaches. Tracey, let's bring you in. So why do you think it's important to really, as social entrepreneurs, right, sort of explore and talk about and think about the work of systems change or social change through a trauma-informed lens?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Katherine. I think, we came across this because we bumped our heads. So we came into the social entrepreneurship space, having myself come from business, really trying to support. Initially, our first project was unemployed mothers to start small businesses. And we had a great model, and we thought it was going to be super successful. Because we had a very cerebral sort of linear idea of it's this, the theory of change, this, ta-da, everybody's going to be successful and we will eradicate poverty in families. And we were 2 years, everybody's laughing because I think many of us came into this world thinking it would be that simple. Why wouldn't anybody grab an opportunity as amazing as the opportunity that you're putting on the table? And 2 years into our work, working exclusively with unemployed mothers, we were absolutely depleted. We really couldn't understand why a mother who was living in poverty, who had 2.5 children to feed, kept sabotaging the opportunity. That's really what it was. And quickly moved from, we called it the gratitude curve, moved from this is great, please let me, please make me join the program, into entitlements. And then, back into sabotage. And it was a very, very exhausting and complex thing that we really didn't know and understand. And it was at that point that we actually considered closing. And really, I used to say it was too hard to help. But what we didn't understand is how deeply affected most of the women we're working with by trauma, both individual trauma, both collective trauma. We work exclusively with Black women, related to South Africa's history and being a Black woman, way even before apartheid and colonization and all sorts of things, related to gender-based violence. She's a single mother. There's so much trauma that she's experienced, in her life and today. Just moving from her home to our program could be a traumatic event for her. And it was only when we got deep insight from a woman that literally was God-given to us, and her name was Vivian Schultz, really to help us understand, that many of these women were living what, I can't say amygdala, so we call it the primitive brain, but they were living in their primitive brain on a daily basis. And when she self-sabotaged, I used to say to her, what were you thinking? You've really, sabotaged an incredible opportunity. And I recently came across a model, which is the one-handed model to understand what goes on in the brain. And the one-handed model, puts the amygdala like this, and then the prefrontal cortex, down at the bottom. And what this shows you is that when the amygdala or the primitive brain is stimulated, it's called popping your lid. And what that means is when you ask her what was she thinking, the answer is she wasn't thinking, because the primitive brain is in control. And so many of the decisions she made were in that mode. And so it was only when we understood that we actually changed absolutely everything about our program. And now it's number one, we have to create self-awareness of how these traumas, whether it's, getting in the public transport today or past trauma from early years, are showing up every single day. I think that's the point. They show up every single day. They become patterns of behavior. And first we have to create awareness. In most cases, these women have never heard these concepts. They've never talked about their emotions. They've never seen the patterns. We always say, a fish doesn't know it swims in water. And this is just her life. And by creating the self-awareness, and we use a specific tool to do that, we can then start the healing process. But as I say, we have tools now that we can do it en masse, rather than, having resources to do it one-on-one with each individual. We do it in groups. We do it programmatically right throughout our program. It's weaved in. And so that's really why I'm so passionate about it, because it really was the key that unlocked and is the key as to why our program is successful now. If we hadn't discovered that, I don't think we'd be around.
Thank you both so much for sharing that. And it reminds me, Vinya, we had an interview, as you know, a while back. I'm just going to share this. You talked about, sort of why wouldn't you grasp this opportunity, right? These jobs. And this is something that I found so insightful that you shared with me at that time, right? So you see all the ways that unresolved trauma manifests, as mental health, addiction, behavior, violence, but there is no recognition. You were talking about that lack of acknowledgement earlier. And so, no, we don't have this, we just need to create jobs. And so therefore people have to deal with it in their own private way. I'm wondering if both of you can build on that quote a little bit and tease out for us further. So, this notion that it's individual and it's collective, right? What are some of the ways that you see, these intergenerational and collective traumas, the historical traumas, Vinya, you referred to several of them as well, manifesting, kind of also their individual expressions. So Tracey, I heard one of the things you said, self-sabotaging behavior is one, but are there other, I don't know, kind of recognizable manifestations or behaviors that, just a quick, simpler example or so that you'd like to offer for us?
Yes. So from our perspective, Vivian has designed a tool called the Hardwires tool, and participants ask a series of questions, and she then names 16 different hardwires that can show up. And by giving those names that are, recognizable names, you start to see the patterns. So, for example, one of the hardwires would be the victim hardwire. Okay. And then she starts to show you the behavior of how a victim shows up. And you go, oh my goodness, that me, I see myself in that pattern. She talks about the external locus hardwire. So for those of you who are not in the sort of medical field or psychology field, external locus is you can never learn from your mistakes, because you are blaming everything outside of yourself. And you will hear this pattern all the time. I can't because. And this often goes with the entitlement mentality. If you give me more, then I can. Okay. And we got sucked into this. Oh, I must be doing something wrong. My program must do more for you. And it just becomes a vicious cycle, and that person never grows and develops. It's a very hard one to break. They're unlikely to grow and develop because there's no accountability and responsibility for their actions. We see, she calls it unconducive parenting, and how that shows up in patterns, where either you were underloved or overloved. Low resources is another one, where even if you were super wealthy, even Oprah talks about this. Oprah's biggest fear is not having enough money. I mean, that is the craziest, the craziest thing, an idea. But still today, as one of the richest women in the world, because Oprah grew up in poverty, she has a low resource mindset, or a low resource fear. And therefore that might show up in ways that how you handle and manage money. I think she's doing okay with that, but it doesn't mean that it's not there. Addictions, it shows up in so many different ways. And once we help individuals identify for themselves these hardwires, then they actually start to walk around and say, oh, there was my victim hardwire. Oh my goodness, there she shows up again. And by recognizing and naming it, you can actually start to do what we call the rewiring journey. It's if you're just continuing to walk blindly through the world, just this just being something that happens to you and not recognizing it, then you can't go on a growth journey. So that for us has been an incredibly powerful tool. We rolled it out right throughout our organization. More than 1,500 people have done their hardwires. And what it did is it absolutely fast-tracked the development process and the transformation process. We then work with coaches who understand the hardwires process. We work in coaching groups. And it was almost, our coaches have a year with the women, and many of them felt there was something that was stuck. By starting with the hardwires assessment and owning the hardwires assessment, we are able to get into the rewiring journey so much quicker. So it really has been a very powerful tool for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Tracey. And I think you've got some invitations to share more in the chat. But this notion of the stuckedness, you know, that's interesting that you mentioned that. Many of the practitioners we interviewed said something similar. It's a sense of stuckedness, of mud that I just can't seem to move through. So yeah, thank you for all of those examples. Vinya, what would you like to add? Sort of how does it manifest? What is it that you see?
Yeah, I think Tracey captured most of it. Now we have also seen risk-taking behavior. You know, the victimhood itself, you know, translates into various forms of violent reactions. Also, domestic violence, corporal punishment in schools, you know, victimization of children. So all these things are, you can really observe a pattern, particularly in the areas where you know, communities have been exposed to a lot of violence. So we talk about intergenerational transmission of trauma. As important is also intergenerational transmission of hatred, particularly when it involves different communities. And you have to really address that, and that requires, you know, even involving children in collective, you know, action. Maybe sometimes it's about art and music, and so there is a way that you can notice, and then you train even school teachers how to detect very early individuals, children who are you know, manifesting these signs of trauma, being exposed to trauma. And then there are other tools that we introduce, some of them, you know, like what Tracey mentioned. And so that way the community itself takes responsibility. They are sensitized not to see it from a very superficial way. And also bringing in this entrepreneurship and that kind of providing economic opportunities so that they can develop self-esteem, dignity. I think what is lost in most of these violent situations is dignity, particularly amongst women. You know, you really lose your self-esteem, and regaining that, creating an environment for them to, you know, really recapture their own strengths, you know. So that is very important. And when you offer economic opportunities, it's not, you are not expecting that to, you know, be the sole contributor towards healing, but when it's combined with other psychological and spiritual interventions, then it is so powerful, and then you can really identify and also respond to trauma.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both so much. I just want to, so we're going to open it up for a wider conversation, you know, sort of a bigger circle in just a few minutes. So a couple of final questions from my side, and you know, Tracey, Vinya, I don't know who would like to take which one. The first is this notion of you know, systemic trauma, and you know, what does that even mean? And I, you know, how much we'll be able to unpack here together. But Vinya, you said something a moment ago about patterns, right? So that these same patterns that and responses that manifest in us as individuals, and we could think about them at the level of organizations, communities, and even systems. And both of you, Sri Lanka and South Africa, right? You've been on the front lines of trying to not just scale your program, right, but make the system work better for everyone. And so you can see how systems can be, in a way, traumatized and traumatizing, and reproduce those same patterns. So I'm curious if what that's, you know, kind of surfacing for either of you, you know, sort of what does that mean? What does it look like? You know, how does that manifest our systems as traumatizing? And then I'd love to move us on to healing. Like, so what do we do about it? And that'll be my last question for both of you before we open it up. But I don't know.
So one of the patterns that we see extensively is the trauma of mainly not having a present father. And so under apartheid, with the system that was orchestrated, you were relocated to a homeland, but there was no work in the homeland. So the father had to go and find work outside, and he was often gone for a year, maybe even more. And in that destruction of the system, of the family system, we lost family, and many men ended up having multiple families. You know, people will tell you, my father had 10 children. I only found that out sort of by accident, you know, in different cities that he worked in. In South Africa now, in this generation, more than 60% of mothers are single parents, and fathers provide no support. And the way we see that showing up is we literally have humans walking around with a hole in their soul. I don't think there's anything more hurtful than being abandoned by a living parent. Death is one thing, but knowing that you are rejected daily, and no matter how old you are, the logic of it doesn't sit. It's a hard thing. And so just talking about that and understanding that it is showing up. What is happening is we have a high prevalence of teenage pregnancy, because this young girl who's grown up with a hole in her soul because there's no relationship with daddy is desperate for the father connection, and she then ends up falling in love at 16, often with an older man, and thinks that if she has his baby, she will keep him. And of course, she falls pregnant, and the minute she says, you know, hi sweetheart, I'm pregnant, he is out the door, and the next generation grows up fatherless. And so we have to address that with young girls. We actually have to talk about it with young girls. We actually have to talk about it with fathers. We're running in collaboration with another Schwab fellow, Garth Jaffett, and his company Heartlines, a Fathers Matter program to actually get fathers talking and understanding how critically important their role is, and understanding the whole dynamics of why this happens. And that's proving to be super powerful. So that's just like one example that if we don't stop the cycle, if we don't get and address the system, we will just have continuous trauma from one generation to the next generation. Yeah, so that would be my input as an example.
Right, and just to tease that out, so we see the collective that states sanctioned in a way, or sponsored even, right, aspect of it, and now the intergenerational, you know, sort of aspect of it that you're pointing to, and there's an individual manifestation, right, in these individual lives, but it is both collective and intergenerational nature. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Tracey. Vinya.
Yes, so in our context, you know, we have seen, of course, the violent phase of our conflict ended with one party winning the war. So then the victor defines the narration. So it gets written into a history which is not very inclusive. Now, in South Africa, I think there was a mechanism, the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which looked at structural injustices, structural discriminations. Now, in our case, we also needed, after such a violent conflict, where so many numbers of people got killed, young people from both communities lost their lives, livelihoods, property, right? So you need a healing mechanism which goes beyond an individual level, but also at an institutional level. So looking at how our own history, which extends to like 2,500 years, how that is, you know, interpreted or written. So we have seen the victor writing the history in a way that is not very inclusive or bringing communities together. So then one community may feel still that, you know, my trauma is not healed. So the whole notion of how you deal with the past. So dealing with the past requires a certain conscious effort by all institutions in the country, and then you have to identify these institutional structures are not going to lead to reconciliation, no, you know, bringing people together and help in healing the trauma. So we have to look at a multi-ethnic, multi-religious kind of approaches where we redefine the past as well, and then make sure that such violent phases never recur again. And everyone has a role to play, and the healing itself, the person who is involved in such processes genuinely feels that, I'm part of building peace. I'm part of building peace within myself, inner peace, and creating outer peace in changing institutions, influencing policies, influencing legislations. And that's the process that we are in. It's very difficult. It's now nearly 15 years since the end of the conflict, end of the armed phase of the conflict, but the factors which led to the conflict have not disappeared, nor the individual and collective trauma. So we have a long way to go, and there are lessons that we can learn from other countries like South Africa, and we are trying to define our own way of dealing with the past. Say majority belong to Buddhist community, and how do we see dealing with such mental stress conditions from a religious point of view. So there are a lot of attempts where we try to bring in the kind of healing through spiritual and economic and also political and social dimensions.
Thank you so much for that, Vinya. Thank you also, Chris, for your prompts. We'd love to hear your thoughts, reflections, what's coming up for those of you in the audience. If you have your own experiences, questions you'd like to ask of the panelists. I'd love to just in a minute pick up on a thread that that Vinya sort of referred to there, and with a concluding thought here, which is the collective dimension of trauma that we've been speaking about requires a collective context for healing. And again, in the practitioner interviews that we've been conducting, and I don't want to spend too much time on the definition, but rather get into the practices. Sort of what do those? So how is the question? How do we go about do those? I'm really curious if not just for you, Vinya and Tracey, but for everyone here, whether this resonates and you use any of these practices in your work, traditions, cultural identities, language, a lot of embodiment practices, of course, group meditations. Vinya, you spoke about singing, of course, making music together, healing circles, engaging, sort of with nature. Then you talked about the power of narrative. So stepping into, our own stories and witnessing other stories. You also talked about spirituality and religion. So, and that goes by a lot of different, kind of names in different contexts. But, and it might even be just about acknowledging our ancestors, or oral traditions and stories. These are some of the practices for collective healing that we came across among the practitioners that we interviewed. So I'd love to offer that and then open it up for thoughts, reactions, and questions from the group, and then Tracey and Vinya, maybe what we can have you do is respond to that towards the end as well.
That's great. Thank you very much, Katherine. Just a reminder to Caitlin to turn off our recording at this time.
I would like to say big thank you to each of you for being so kind of candid and giving us these great insights into this issue, which I think needs to be talked a lot more about and to be understood a lot more about. And when we get to that understanding, we'll be a lot better at what we do. So thank you so much for this past hour. It's been fascinating and some great insights. So thank you very much indeed.
I think it was a wonderful session, and I'm so grateful to you all for giving up so much time when I know you're all so busy. I know, Vinya, you're traveling, and so thank you to you all. It was great.
Thanks, everybody.
Katherine,
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye, Vinya. Take care.